It was a social theory. It was the idea that the arts could transform society and make it a better, more democratic, more egalitarian, more humane world.
Most people understand that the 20th century in Europe was the fountainhead of extraordinary revolutions both in the arts and in politics.
Something had gone terribly wrong with society because World War I had killed a fair part of a generation of Europeans.
After the First World War, a lot of people are shocked. A new kind of republic will start. They also have seen the inhumanity of these industrial design products, the machines who kill the people.
There's a clear hope. It was a belief in progress.
Art became something that could be used as a weapon to try to communicate to a larger social base.
It becomes a basis for addressing the changed circumstances of modern times and attempting to create a system of design that would make it possible to have a world in which people would be comfortable living, not a world in which the industrialization was taking them apart or destroying them.
We think of this great melting pot of things happening. 1919 is this moment of an attempt at a government, but great internal strife, great questioning of Germany's place. They've lost the war, they have no money, there's great social unrest, there's political unrest, and art needs to respond.
In the 1920s and 30s, this continuation of creativity in Weimar Germany in particular, so we see Brecht and Weil, we see the continuation of the Dada spirit which moves into surrealism, you see the paintings of Otto Dix.
There was a feeling with the end of the war that expressionism could be something that could unify people. There was a great social need at the time, there was great suffering, and that art could be a way to unite Germany, unite society, bring a kind of spiritual uplift to humanity as a whole.
What there was a notion that you had to change the world. I think one of the things which people felt very intensely was that it was your moral duty as you are alive, and I guess for many as you have survived the First World War, to change the world, and you have to make the world a better place.
It was a renaissance in artistic production. It was a time of great conflict, which led to a lot of different artistic exploration.
If we look across to Russia and St. Petersburg, we see the futurists, and we see this kind of work developing in some of the more formal theatres.
It's that conflict between old and new and varieties of ways of thinking about things that really allow so much of the production and the variety that we remember about the Weimar Republic to occur.
Visual artists suddenly grab what they see as a decadent theatre and start dressing up actors and actresses in costumes which they perceive as works of art. They start using noise as music to attack what they saw as the decadence of the previous eras in art.
You had to be modern. You had to be off your time. You definitely must not be nostalgic for what is behind you. So you have to be off the moment. And that off the moment is this notion of modernity.
In the same street in Zurich where the legendary Cabaret Voltaire took place in just over a few weeks during the First World War, Lenin was living in the same street. So this linkage between politics and revolutionary art was all happening at the same time.
They tried to find a new way of reform, to look how we could start new with the young people in a new generation, and to give the world a new kind of design.
In Britain, there was a kind of fear of the mass, and in Germany, there was also this concept of massified society. What do we do with all these people? How do we house them? How do we transport them? How do we entertain them? How do we deal with their spiritual and physical health?
It was not the question of new architecture or new furniture design. It was more or less the question to design a new world.
The next great sort of messianic style then is actually what's around us. It's the Bauhaus and style and that kind of utopian approach that in a way is adopted from Expressionism. A style that's not just painted, not just designed in buildings, but also in furniture and clothing and everything. This kind of unifying style that can somehow bring a new kind of level of spiritual healing, I guess.
The Bauhaus is generally thought to be the most important school of architecture and design of the 20th century. It was founded by the German architect Walter Gropius.
The Bauhaus, in many ways, becomes a kind of flagship. It's a style, or it's a school, or it's a movement in some ways that can be seen very much as an emblem of the government.
Through what you make comes this obligation. It needs to have a wider reach. And what they are all very interested in is that art is totally not about self-expression. It's nothing to do with saying how you feel or, where you are personally at. It's all to do with how can you change things around you.
They had the belief that to do what they were doing was itself certainly an optimistic act, and in some ways it was a utopian act.
For the Bauhaus, that craft-oriented sort of bent at the time has a lot to do with looking back to the medieval guilds and this kind of social utility of art, and also a great moment in artistic production in Germany.
The Bauhaus wants not to design architecture. It was more in Weimar the view back to the ideals of the medieval period with a cathedral. And the cathedral is not architecture. The cathedral is a building. In German we call it Bau. It's like this Gesamtkunstwerk. All the disciplines, sculptors, painters, fabric designers, architects, handcrafts, work together with the society on the image of the city and for the society.
Many of the people associated with the Bauhaus were politically on the left. Some of them were seriously communist, but most of them had come from more or less middle-class backgrounds and were more interested in a kind of social democratic future, something like the welfare state that exists across Western and Northern Europe today.
A lot of the artists, a lot of the people who came to the Bauhaus had a very direct experience of the First World War.
And it was very, very conscious that the whole range of human activities were developed to deal with mass society. And with that came the so-called utopian ideas of we can make life better, we can make things better. And this is an opportunity. And the rhetoric of the time was always, we're building a new world, we're building a new man, we're building a new society.
Some of the enthusiastic designers, like architects like Walter Gropius and the others, go in distance to this question of industrialization because they are really shocked about the situation and they try to find a new way of reform.
People could live materially sufficient and intellectually and spiritually fulfilling lives.
But it was really an effort, I think, to also make a cohesive social style. There's a great interest in institutionalizing the style, in making a cohesive style that can be spread out into society, and to also produce things that have a kind of resonance with society.
Part of what the Bauhaus was about was taking artists, the best artists in Germany at the time, who were all mystics and sort of goofy guys off doing their own thing, individual genius art heroes, and getting them to apply their understanding of form and color to, or explain their understanding of form and color to a very different audience.
Among the people who were involved in teaching there at the program were the German-born architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, as well as the Hungarian-born photographer and designer Laszlo Moholy-Nagy.
He also invited as masters Itten and other artists like Klee and Kandinsky to come to the school, coming from this tradition of arts and crafts. They did not teach technical development, they tried to find new forms.
Quite extraordinary as a place, really, because it puts experiment at the forefront of teaching.
And this was the time, about 1922-23, that also Gropius changed his concept. He goes then to the question, art and technique in new unity. He wants to combine the two poles of design, art and technological development. This was also the time they make a change in the stuff of the Bauhaus. And for Itten comes Moholy-Nagy, a person who looks very clearly to the future in the question of find new kinds of communication design, new kinds of painting, new kinds of reading and writing.
So with Moholy came a completely new sort of stream of ideas into the Bauhaus, because most of the appointments until then, if one thinks of people like Klee, Kandinsky, Itten as the most important teacher on the preliminary course, they were a generation older, at least a generation older. They were established artists in their own right. They were very much artists, painters really, which was quite curious that at the Bauhaus, which right from the outset had this idea to promote art and design under the auspices of architecture. And suddenly you had Moholy, who was this Renaissance man of the 20th century, who was doing photography, who was doing painting, who questions the notion of painting, who then very quickly got into graphic design.
And this was also a great influence for the whole situation of the school before it goes to Dessau. The Bauhaus was so well known in this period, after this 4 years, that more than 5 cities want to get the Bauhaus. In Dessau, Gropius has only the possibility to build his own school. What could you do better than design your own school building and to give your program a three-dimensional sign to show how all the disciplines work together? It's a manifestation of the ideas of the Bauhaus. From here, Dessau is the root. It started in a philosophical, in an ideal sense in Weimar, but here from Dessau it goes out to the world. The workshop idea of Gropius, how the things are connected. That you have the preliminary course, the people come to the Bauhaus and start new with experimental design questions to test and prove with materials, colors, construction. It comes from Itten and was continued with Moholy and Albers too. And from here then to the United States with these persons also. The workshop is divided in furniture, fabric, metal, wall painting and so on. And the end is the architecture class in the center. If you look, the building has no central point, but one of the central point is the staircase here and the office of Gropius. And on top level, you have this architecture class. And then you have also the circle of the Gropius program.
There were continuously, through the Weimar Republic, efforts to control publishing of art portfolios, the kinds of posters that could be seen, to control the media, not just for political reasons, but for social reasons.
It was always understood, especially in Gropius's program, that the formal, the architectural, the design element also had a political component or was part of a political environment that needed to be recognized.
And in the end of the 20s, there was a change. Because the middle of the 20s was what was called the Golden 20s, the Roaring 20s. It was a time of economical growing, but it was a very, very fragile situation. The world crisis, the Black Friday comes, and so on in 29. Also, the economical goes more and more down in Germany with success. And social questions come more and more up to a higher level.
There was a battle of huge political fronts. Fascists were fighting communists. And I think that cut across nation and to some extent cut across class boundaries. And I think the communists necessarily organised themselves in international terms. And I think that the issues at the time were so enormous in Europe that you had to ally yourself in one way or another.
And this change of this more and more going to the left, Gropius quit his job here in Dessau. He goes to his private office in Berlin and he wants to build architecture. The second director of the Bauhaus becomes Hannes Meyer. As a regional Marxist, he was coming from Switzerland. He was busy there also with settlements for lower class people and middle class people. And he gets to the house more a left direction and more the social task. But at the end of the 20s, the right parties becomes more and more power, in opposite to the left, and Meyer was fired because they did not want here a red Bauhaus in Dessau. Mies van der Rohe becomes the director of the Bauhaus. It was the next step. And Mies changed completely the Bauhaus. He did not want this workshop idea, or continue with this workshop idea from Gropius or Meyer. He changed the Bauhaus here, the reduced workshop work, only for the licenses to get the money. And on the other hand, he brings on top his architectural education, master classes for architecture. But in 1932, the Nazi party got so much power here in Dessau that it was not possible to continue with the Bauhaus. Under the pressure of the Nazis, the Bauhaus was closed in October 1932. Mies van der Rohe tried to continue with the Bauhaus as a private institute, because the Bauhaus gets more and more success. So he goes to Berlin with the name Bauhaus, but again under the pressure of the Nazis from Dessau, they closed the Bauhaus in Berlin too, in a moment that also Mies quit then the Bauhaus in 1933. And this was really the end of the Bauhaus.
That effort at control and that effort at trying to identify very carefully what is accepted and what is not accepted runs through the Weimar Republic and sort of has its greatest culmination in the Degenerate Art exhibition.
The Bauhaus, like much of modern art, was considered to be degenerate. Its position in Germany was increasingly difficult.
Many people who were creative during the Weimar Republic were singled out by the government, and their work was, in a way, sort of typified. It was analyzed in an almost, we could say, pseudo-scientific way. There was an effort at pointing to this art, looking to these expressions as things that had illness in them, that had degeneracy in them, which was something that wasn't okay for a healthy society. That degeneracy in expression was something that needed to be contained like an illness.
There's a larger migration of European modernism to the United States as a direct result of the rise of fascism in Europe, in Spain, in Germany, in Italy, in Russia.
Even though Mies and Gropius were ethnically, genealogically German and from Christian families, and so they didn't have to leave Germany as many others did. They too felt themselves that Germany was, in the 1930s, no longer a place where it would be possible to live.
The migration had two parts: commercial photographers, designers who are working in industry in Europe. And they all went to New York. They worked for the major magazines, they worked in advertising, they worked in product development. That was highly successful, and you see results of that throughout publications from really the 30s on in the United States.
In the mid-30s, Gropius, taking Moholy with him, left for England, where he was for a few years before he came to the United States. Mies made the jump directly from Germany to the United States.
The second part of the migration was really the schools, the academic ones. Mies van der Rohe and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy came not to work in New York or to work for commercial clients, but rather to start schools, to really transmit the ideas of European modernism.
The new Bauhaus was one of the outposts of the original Bauhaus. A lot of the teachers and instructors, the directors of the Bauhaus had exploded in this diaspora to the States.
In 1937, Moholy was asked to head a school in Chicago based on Bauhaus principles by a group called the Association of Arts and Industries.
Moholy came here with all these ideas about how to integrate art and industry and design. He was working in textiles and photography and painting and sculpture and metalworking and woodworking. And he had this idea of a really cohesive vision of the arts and life.
His idea that, everyone has a creative impulse and that this can be educated, it can be brought out. Total education.
Moholy really wanted to figure out through his teaching ways to integrate art and life, or art and industry. And in the first year, in 1937, the only year of the new Bauhaus, actually these industrialists were a little dismayed at what really happened at the school. Moholy really fostered a very experimental approach. In the spring, in 1939, it opened again as the School of Design, with new management in a way, but still Moholy-Nagy at the helm.
Mies came to Chicago and became head of the Department of Architecture at IIT.
But this is where part of the story tends to split off a little bit. Mies was an architect, and he tended to value the role of architecture more fully. So his program in Chicago was an architecture school, not a school of architecture and design. Moholy was interested in design, and his school was more interested in design, photography, some of the other visual arts. Mies's job and Moholy's job was how do we go about reconstructing that spirit, that kind of school. Both of them had professional practices, but their initial impact was as teachers in these two parallel schools. There's one aspect of the Bauhaus's teaching which is almost universal in the teaching of architecture, and that is the idea that in the very first year or so, students needed a broad foundation to understand any aspect of design. And so there was and still is in many, many schools of architecture around the world a foundation course that is more or less patterned after the foundation course developed at the Bauhaus. It was an opportunity for students to learn about form, color, material, texture. The work with that kind of material then made it possible for them to imagine forms, techniques, devices, tools, spaces, buildings, cities that would themselves be appropriate places in which people could conduct their lives. This deep understanding that to build a city is not something that happens in 5 or 10 years or even a generation. It's something that takes place over many, many generations. One of the things that's wonderful about Chicago is that it has a magnificent site along the lakefront, and so the relationship of the lake and the city is very rich and powerful. What's interesting is that in the relatively short life of the city, it's less than 200 years old, it has created something that is visually stunning. I think it's going to be seen along with probably New York as the great city of the 20th century. And if you want a kind of iconic vision of what the 20th century looked like, Chicago and its skyline seen against the lake will be that image.
The photography program at the ID wouldn't have existed if it hadn't been for Moholy. I mean, it was his passion for photography that caused him to incorporate it initially in what he called the light workshop.
Moholy really took the same approach of exploding a material or a medium. So the way they approach photography is based in part upon Moholy's 8 varieties of photographic vision, where he looks at slow vision and fast vision and multiple exposure and high vantage points and low vantage points and X-ray photography.
Moholy came from a rural shtetl, Mohol, in Hungary, and really came to the big city, first to Warsaw and then to Berlin in 1921, just after the city had been electrified and there were street lights. And his fascination with light starts there. He just saw this tremendous explosion in light as a creative medium. And this was something that sort of drove him from then on.
He wanted to see what were all of the things that photography could do. And he takes this approach to photography at the school and sets up a whole series of exercises and programs. It begins with the photogram. The photogram is a cameraless photograph, and in many cases made even without the need for a dark room. Moholy felt that the photogram was the basis of all photography because it showed all of the gradations possible in a photographic print, from the darkest dark to the lightest light.
European modernism didn't just come here by having Moholy show up in Chicago or Mies show up in Chicago, or having the surrealist painters show up in New York with Peggy Guggenheim. Everybody came. I mean, in 33 to 36, everybody bailed out of Europe because of the political issues that were occurring there, and they went to a lot of places. The United States was a principal one because it was seen as the opposite of fascism. It came to industry and to publication as well as to academia. It wasn't the case that modernism was this goofy little academic idea that where the great professor went to Black Mountain College or to Pratt or the San Francisco Art Institute. It was a massive movement of information. If you look at what the United States was when it showed up, it was painters like Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton.
Art in this, Gropius thought this, I think it's fair to say that Mies thought this, it's fair to say that Moholy thought that art had the opportunity to chart a path into the future, that it was in the nature of being an artist to both see the difficulties or the flaws in the current arrangement of the social fabric and make proposals for the proper solution.
The change that it made was huge, undeniable, enormous, permanent. And it created this school, but it created a lot of other schools.
Again, it was Gropius's insight that this wasn't a piecemeal approach. It wasn't, well, we have to build lots of railroads or we have to build lots of steamships. It's that the problems had to be addressed in a comprehensive way, and that was at the core of what Moholy was attempting to do at the Institute of Design, what Mies was trying to do in the architecture program.
The idea was that there was one set of forms, one set of processes that was appropriate to all the modern world.
Certainly, there was a shortfall, I think, in a lot of Bauhaus thinking, which was this idea that you could visually or aesthetically, you could create this Esperanto, this new language that would be accessible to all and would be equally valid for all.
There was a master at the Bauhaus who designed a universal time schedule. The idea being that since the electric light had liberated us from the tyranny of day and night, that everyone in the world would get up at the same exact time, and march to the factories with their designer lunchboxes. And Paul Hindemith was writing songs for the workers to sing at their drill presses. And, you know, it was, you would take Mises Federal Building and you'd put it in Saudi Arabia, you'd put it in, you know, Mysore, because it was this universal movement. So, no, we don't, that's not globalization, that's called imperialism.
For an age characterized by conflict, by war, by, you know, people constantly clashing in the most violent way over differences, one can sort of see where the appeal of that idea comes from, that you could do something which suddenly would jump across this and, you know, it would be the same for all of us.
They clearly had the evidence that the world needed, their world needed to be rebuilt in a quite different way. And so on that basis, whether you call it practical or utopian because of imagining a better world, they certainly had the evidence that it ought to be done. And they had, as is often the case with people in the design professions, they had the belief that to do what they were doing was itself certainly an optimistic act. And in some ways it was a utopian act.
You could cover the whole spectrum. You could actually say, you know, the Bauhaus was one of the most inspiring art and design schools. It has this idea that you can make good things for everybody.
The formal and material insight and the social and progressive insight are generally imagined to have been both recognized by Gropius in inventing the Bauhaus, establishing it in Germany, and then through his influence and through the school's influence in their first home in Weimar, in their second home in their purpose-built building in Dessau, and in their final home when Mies was director of the Bauhaus.
The modern movement had tremendous influence on packaging, on product development, on communications, and you know, you see that sort of in the 60s, both reaching a kind of peak and also starting to be questioned.
You could go to the completely opposite end of the spectrum and say, it's Bauhaus ideology that has destroyed our cities. That there were monolithic office blocks plonked right into the center of what had organically grown under the, you know, claim of this is good modern design for a modern age.
What's good for a post office is good for a church, is good for a school. Maybe not.
I guess the biggest problem arises where this has informed notions of architecture and urbanism because you need to live with it. This has formed whole cities. But I think it's also true to say that lots of the problem arises from this very uneasy marriage that this ideology entered into with corporate capitalism. One of the greatest naiveties of those people, even people like Moholy and I think even Gropius, was that they somehow thought they could tame capitalism. They somehow thought they could educate that.
The utopian aspect of Mises' work today, in many ways, that is less crucial, less central to people in practice today. There are some for whom it remains important, but that social agenda is, I think, largely been separated from the particular forms associated either with Mies or Moholy.
I mean, fine for Mies to build the Seagram building in New York, and you know, people saying it's the most beautiful skyscraper ever. It has the most lavish budget ever, and it's built with the most extraordinary and exquisite materials. But what comes out of that is, you know, 99,000 copies that are all sort of, you know, baseline really. They are driven by cost and function.
When a sort of movement runs out of steam, and I think certainly the modern movement was running out of steam in the 80s, for instance, and you get sort of reactions against it, the postmodern. Those reactions are based on real concerns that modernism was sort of sexist. It was about male genius art heroes, you know, form givers. It wasn't really about collaborators.
What I think many more people have perceived is that what modernism does is create a kind of multivalent universe in which there are many different ways of responding to the circumstances around you. So whether it's different kinds of art, different kinds of towns, different kinds of, you name it, that what happens is many different approaches or solutions to a given problem are offered.
What's modernism if we get rid of this sort of universal forum thing. What's modernism if we incorporate ideas of teams and collegiality? What's modernism if we admit that everything isn't completely rational? What's modernism if we examine some of the assumptions that we subsequently found to be wanting? Then where would we go from there?
The real challenge, I think, in modernism is that there's the idea that there will be an either-or, that the decisions will be easy to make, I think is going away. And instead what's happening is that we're discovering that values are in conflict. And it's not that value A is better than value B. It's that value A and value B both have qualities and need to be respected. The difficulty is in working out a proper balance between the legitimate values of value A and the legitimate values of value B. In America today, one value is the freedom of religious belief. Another value is freedom of independent inquiry, and for many Americans the conflict between science and religion is becoming a major aspect of discussion. The value of belief is something that most of us would say is a legitimate value. The value of free inquiry in science, I think most of us would say is a legitimate value, but clearly for many Americans they are in genuine conflict, and that's an issue that we have to sort out. I think that that's where the multivalency of modernism becomes its problem. And it may be that because many of these issues were first observed in paintings, poems, art, buildings in the modern era, that helped us crystallize and see the issues and see the problems that lay before us.
Certainly today we have technology that I think many would say has run amok, or at least it's depleting our resources on a global level. And somehow we need to bring a more humane vision to the application of technology and the allocation of our resources if we're going to have a decent world to live in, or for our children to live in. This is the same kind of problem that was faced in the 20s, how to remake a new democratic society out of the wreckage of World War I. Now our question is, how do you remake, or how do you build a humane society out of or before we inevitably wreck the world with our current directions? Some say we're going back to modernism. I don't know where we're going. I do know that the contribution that creative people have to make to what gets built in this world, in the technological world, is tremendous. Designers, creative people contribute by making things that should be successful because they serve real human needs.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
I